So, hello, welcome everyone to Vision Zero Vignettes. We're really happy to have you here. I hope everyone has so far enjoyed the 6th annual Vision Zero Cities Conference. There have been some really engaging discussions so far. Today I was able to catch a few, one about the legacy of Robert Moses's highway construction through New York City, and an interesting keynote address from Congressman Jesus Chuy Garcia about the work that he and his colleagues in the US Congress are doing on issues of transportation safety. So right now we're in for a really fun session. We're going to hear 5 vignettes from 5 amazing individuals that paint a picture of what it means to do the work of Vision Zero on the ground. I'll be your MC today. My name is Bahij Chancey, and I'm on the board of Transportation Alternatives. I'm a graduate student and a researcher at the MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning. I'm also an organizer and an advocate for Transportation Alternatives' work to end traffic violence and make New York City streets safe and accessible to everybody who calls the city home. So thank you all for joining us today for Vision Zero Vignettes. Now, anyone who does this work knows that it takes a lot to conceive of, design, and implement the life-saving physical and policy measures that comprise Vision Zero, and that it draws on professionals from across disciplines. The experience and the work of today's speakers are as varied as the attendees of this conference. They span from activism all the way over to enforcement, and they operate from the local to the national and even onto the global scales. Now, allow me to introduce our speakers for the day. Hailing from New York City is activist, co-founder of Families for Safe Streets, and fellow Transportation Alternatives board member, Mary Beth Kelly. Following Mary Beth, we'll hear from Brooklyn District Attorney, Eric Gonzalez, hailing from Brooklyn, where I am now. Calling in from Aspen, Colorado, we've got landscape architect, planner, and urban designer, as well as CEO of Design Workshop, Kurt Culbertson. Following Kurt's talk, we'll hear, all the way calling in from New Zealand, Skye Duncan, who is the Director of Global Designing Cities Initiative at NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials. And finally, to wrap up the Vision Zero vignettes today, we've got Lisa Gilson, calling in from Arity, who's their head of marketing and design. Now, a short bit about this format before we jump in. Today's vignettes are short and sweet. They'll be just a sample of the amazing work that each of our speakers is doing. That means that each speaker has just 10 minutes. That's not a lot of time. We've made our speakers aware of this. They know, they've agreed to the format. We'll see how well that goes. Now we'll see, and to assist me with timekeeping are the staff at Transportation Alternatives. Thank you very much to M. Friedenberg, Amy Klein, and Julian for helping put this event together. As we go through the talks, the speakers will get a reminder from the staff over at TA. They're running short on time, and if any of our speakers are pushing that 10 minutes, you'll hear from me. I'll interject and try to move us on to the next speaker because we're really eager to hear everyone's talks today. Now, at the end of this session, once we've heard each of the 5 vignettes, we have a bit of time to do some Q&A with our speakers. A few speakers I know will have to run, so the speakers that remain will be able to answer folks' questions. Now, audience, I need your participation here. Please use the Zoom Q&A feature to ask questions of the presenters, and please upvote other questions that you would like to see answered as well. The staff over at TA are going to help me sort through those questions, and we'll see the ones that are most popular. At the end of the session, we'll be posing the questions that you all like the most to our panel of speakers here. That's all on format and logistics. I'm really excited to jump in. And let me introduce our first speaker. She'll be Mary Beth Kelly. Mary Beth Kelly, as I mentioned, is on the board of directors, as well as the advisory council of Transportation Alternatives. She is also co-founder of Families for Safe Streets. In June of 2006, Mary Beth and her husband, Dr. Carl Henry Nacht, were cycling together, as they had done for the last 35 years, when Henry was hit in the crosswalk by a tow truck. He died several days later due to his injuries. Immediately following his death, Mary Beth Kelly knocked on TA's door. They were the only organization in New York City addressing traffic violence. With Transportation Alternatives, Mary Beth has worked to channel her rage and her grief into advocacy and activism. Her vision, like TA's, is cities reclaimed from the automobile for walking, biking, and public transportation. It's my pleasure and my honor to introduce Mary Beth Kelly, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bahij, and thank you, Transportation Alternatives, for putting this all together. Crisis with a C comes from the Greek crisis with a K, and it's translated as a fork in the road, a choice to be made. We tell our stories, that's what we do, at Families for Safe Streets, and we use the power of narrative to change hearts and minds and policy. Here's a story I tell, although I do not really have to go into it again because Bahij told it, and I appreciate that. Henry's death, my husband's death, put me at a fork in the road. I had to choose how to be with the grief. And when I knocked on TA's door, I really felt that I needed them as much as I hoped they needed me. And they welcomed me in, and I'll never forget that first winter at a rally, having read about Vision Zero, and standing on the steps of City Hall demanding that this program in Sweden come to New York, shouting, "We're New York, we should lead." Well, we did, to a degree. Anyone in New York knows that we have not had the full commitment. So in 2014, a group of fellow New Yorkers, also anguished by the loss of family members to road death, came together and formed FSS. Every member has either lost a loved one in traffic violence or has been severely injured. We have 4,000 life-altering injuries on the streets of New York every year. So these families all became advocates to achieve the vision of zero deaths. 6 years later, New York lawmakers know us well. We've not quieted down, we haven't gone away, and we've even gone to jail when our other attempts at advocacy to save the speed safety cameras in New York City were threatened to not exist. We've met with success. We've lowered the speed limit. We secured 750 speed cameras to cover every school district in the city. We helped pass a bill to take habitually dangerous drivers off the road, along with other bills that we've worked on. And we've brought protected bike lanes to neighborhood streets and to deadly boulevards. But we still have a long road to travel. Currently, we have an uptick in crashes and deaths in the city during COVID due to an increase in driving and speeding. Within the last few weeks, FSS and TA held vigils after the deaths of a 4-year-old, a 7-year-old, and an assistant district attorney. We take strength from the knowledge that history is filled with stories of people compelled by their pain, confronted by injustice, and maybe we should just remember them sometimes and acknowledge that we're not original. The white-scarfed Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, who protested every week for 29 years against the Argentinian dictatorship, and who brought 1,000 torturers and murderers to trial. In the uptick in fake news and dictatorships around the world, they have come together again in the plaza. Some of them now, most of them in their 80s, come in wheelchairs. Mamie Till, a school teacher and mother of Emmett Till, who demanded that major media be permitted to photograph her son. And her son, Emmett, had been lynched and brutally tortured. But this woman, in unprecedented activism, became a catalyst for the civil rights movement. Now, a new chapter of grief-inspired activism has propelled thousands to gather and protest the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, demanding reform of police practices and putting an end to the violence of structural racism in America. The prism of transportation readily offers views of glaring injustices. Poor communities of color have less access to public transportation and are usually the last to receive street redesign. Truck routes run through poor neighborhoods, raising the rates of asthma dramatically, as well as crashes and deaths, particularly of children. As a movement, we are dedicated to finding justice for all victims of traffic violence. It is in our culture to expect accountability. But I've asked myself a number of times, what should accountability for traffic deaths look like? If the goal is behavioral change, then punishment in the form of jail time has not proven effective for young people or adults. Could we find a way for those who have caused harm to repair that harm in the most productive way for society, for the collective good, to add value where they have caused loss? In Brooklyn, the Driver Accountability Program, begun by the Center for Court Innovation and with our involvement, gives drivers with criminal offenses that do not involve a victim a choice to participate in a program incorporating two principles of restorative justice: self-reflection and self-empowerment. It also shows them a video of 6 of us telling our stories. At the end of the time, the participants identify to commit to eliminating 3 behaviors in driving that they have to become mindful of and stop. In an NYPD follow-up survey, the majority of the participants in the program reported lasting behavioral change in their driving. So here's a question I've been asking myself, and I do not represent FSS in pursuing this line of thinking. This is me here, but I know I'm not alone. I've been asking myself ever since Henry died, even as we fight the good fight, will we achieve the cultural shift that we are after? If we do not face the fact that in the current culture of speed combined with dangerous street designs, the stage has long been set to turn even good drivers into killers with cars. I know this may not be popular, but please bear with me. The more than 30,000 traffic deaths a year on highways in cities and in small communities across America means that each year we add nearly as many unintentional killers. The unintentional killer, and I'm not speaking about habitually reckless drivers, they carry a moral injury, what is often experienced by veterans of war and contributes to their high incidence of suicide. I care about this as a member of society. I care about it as a psychotherapist. I care about it because of the work we do. These people are devastated to have killed someone. To atone for it takes great emotional courage, but it is also restorative. It requires strength of the victim as well to consider the pain of the accidental killer. It requires purposeful emotional intelligence. I know that I have to dig for courage. I'd have to dig for courage to sit across the table from the man who killed my husband. But I've often wished for just that, to tell him how his behavior that night affected me and my family. I also need to hear his story, his regrets, his sorrow, how that deed has affected his life in these 14 years, and his willingness to do this in a gesture of atonement. He may not be a person who could do that, but others could and may welcome the opportunity. Could our reaching out, difficult as that might be to accomplish, swell the ranks of those committed to stand with us to achieve 0 deaths? Peter Norton, a historian at the University of Virginia, has described the myth conceived of by the advertisers for the car manufacturers almost a century ago. It trumpeted America's love affair with the car at a time when, in fact, very few Americans could even afford a car. Gradually, what seeped into the zeitgeist was the idea that being an American meant owning a car. A cultural divide grew between the people who drove and those who rode the bus, the haves and the have-nots. A kind of emotional manipulation put the car at the top of the transportation hierarchy, especially after GM and Firestone purchased the light rails across the country just to destroy the competition. This kind of thinking encouraged big spending on highways and underfunding of public transit that led directly to today's sickening toll of road deaths. In The Unbearable Lightness of Being, Milan Kundera refers to a word in Czech that is a constellation of feelings. Litost names an indefinable longing entwined with remorse and grief. Every member of FSS knows litost, but first-person accounts by accidental killers, or CADIs, which stands for causing accidental death or injury, revealed that they too experience litost. There's no word for it in any other language. A very good example can be found in the September 18th, 2017 New Yorker article by Alice Gregory. The title was "The Sorrow and the Shame of the Accidental Killer." It profiled Marianne Gray, a psychologist, now in her 60s. Gray, at 23, killed a boy with her car. Dr. Gray could not bring herself to tell anyone what had happened until she was in her 50s. All her life, she carried a heavy burden of remorse and shame and a longing to go back in time to undo what she had done. Learning that we have all grown up on a manipulative myth about the need for cars may help bond victims and accidental killers in a commitment to safer streets. But it has to be acknowledged as well that we are all often handicapped while listening to each other by what Arlie Hochschild terms empathy walls. Hochschild, a retired professor emerita of sociology at UC Berkeley, describes how we construct emotional walls to eliminate feelings of compassion for those we deem unworthy. For her book, Strangers in Their Own Land, Hochschild, a liberal Californian Democrat, conducted Muslim interviews in Louisiana. Taking down her own empathy walls allowed for the deep stories or felt experience to be shared. She learned about the pain of lost livelihoods, broken communities, and oil companies given government carte blanche while the ordinary person felt bullied, all of which fueled their support for a Donald Trump presidency. To listen, to remain curious, Hochschild reminds us, does not mean capitulating. Emotional factors help explain why in New York City we depend on electronic enforcement of the speed limit. Police under-enforce traffic laws and often misrepresent a crash to the press, routinely placing the blame on the victim rather than the driver. One explanation for this bias is that most police live outside the city limits and identify as drivers, not as urban pedestrians or cyclists. They drive their cars into the city for work, since they can park for free, often on the sidewalk at the precinct. Summoned to a crash site in their cars, they are in their police cars, they are far more likely to feel empathy for the drivers who remind them of themselves. Police are also not trained as paramedics. The sight of a pedestrian or a cyclist who's been run over by several tons of steel is hard to confront emotionally and can elicit empathy walls affecting the capacity of impartial judgment. Families for Safe Streets now supports 8 chapters around the country, all of them nurtured by monthly calls from New York FSS members. Speaking with some of these folks this summer, I was struck by how often, without the equivalent of a TA in their communities, they felt discouraged. Their work, our work, requires emotional labor and hours spent networking, lobbying, and raising funds to move the dial. We need more TAs for sure, but we may also need more people standing with us who identify as drivers. Might we be stronger together? Again, history suggests we would be stronger standing together. The German commitment and reconciliation following the 1994 Tutsi genocide suggests that the path made of atonement, truth, and reconciliation is the one that leads to repair, justice, and lasting change. I have another, where are we, Bahij?
Just to interject, you're running out of time, so I'll have to ask you to conclude, but thank you very much so far.
That's the end. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mary Beth Kelly, for that really fascinating talk. It's inspiring, as always, to hear from you as a fellow activist, and I know that you're definitely in the fight. I remember a few weeks ago hearing you on Brian Lehrer call in to pose the mayor those questions and really ask what he's doing to address traffic violence on our streets right now.
Thank you, Bahij. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's an apt reminder that all of us, when looking at this issue, need to look at it not only from one side, but to look at it from the sides of every stakeholder, every person who's involved in these types of horrendous crashes, that it's not ever almost intentional, but that we've got to consider all sides and come to empathetic and emotionally informed verdicts. Speaking of verdicts, we're going to move on to Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez. It's a pleasure to introduce Brooklyn DA Gonzalez, who made history in November 2017 when he became the first Latino district attorney elected in New York State. DA Gonzalez was instrumental in ensuring a smooth transition in leadership after the tragic death of his predecessor, the late Ken Thompson, for whom Gonzalez had served as Chief Assistant District Attorney. DA Gonzalez began his legal career at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office upon his graduation from law school in 1995 and spent several years as a junior and then senior assistant in various bureaus within the office. Since his appointment to lead the office, DA Gonzalez has implemented his own trailblazing initiatives, including bail reform, a young adult court, expansion of non-prosecution of marijuana possession, a pre-court diversion program for low-level drug offenders, and a policy to reduce unfair immigration consequences in criminal cases. DA Gonzalez is now working on a signature initiative, Justice 2020, that establishes a vision of keeping Brooklyn safe and strengthening trust in our justice system by ensuring fairness and equal justice for all. It's my pleasure to introduce DA Gonzalez, who will speak to us about the Brooklyn model for street safety, a victim-centered approach to prevention and prosecution. I'll turn it over to you.
Good evening, and thank you for the kind introduction. I want to thank Transportation Alternatives for inviting me to participate in the Vision Zero conference. This is an important opportunity to strategize regarding policies and advocacy that will bring us closer to our goal of 0 deaths on our streets from traffic violence. And organizations like Transportation Alternatives and Families for Safe Streets have really changed the conversation about street safety in the last few years. From the language we use to describe the problem to the solutions that are on the table. In my office, we no longer talk about car accidents because accidents imply that no one was at fault, that the event was unavoidable. Instead, we talk about crashes and collisions. And we speak about traffic violence because those terms more accurately depict what's happening on our streets. For me, street safety has always been a priority. I meet with families who have lost loved ones to traffic violence, and those are always heartbreaking conversations. No one ever expects when their loved one goes out for a walk or goes out for a ride that that'll be the last time they return home. A few weeks ago, we suffered a tragic loss in the Brooklyn District Attorney's family. My friend, my colleague, Sarah Pitts, was struck and killed in Williamsburg in Brooklyn while riding her bike. Sarah was an extraordinary person. She was a dedicated and compassionate senior assistant district attorney in our appeals bureau. And she was widely known in the cycling community for her work with Riders for Rights. Sarah was a fighter for justice, both in the courtroom and outside of the courthouse. And her senseless death has reinforced in me as district attorney and so many of our colleagues here in the DA's office that we have to do more to make our streets safer for people like Sarah. Her death was avoidable. Her death was the responsibility of things that could have been changed, like street design in that neighborhood and obstructions that made it impossible to see her and to see the vehicle that struck her. Earlier this year, the Brooklyn DA's office made a major shift in how we're addressing traffic violence. And we started with the goal of better protecting pedestrians and cyclists. We formed a brand new bureau called the Street Safety Bureau. Like its predecessor, the Vehicular Crimes Unit, the Street Safety Bureau also works with the New York City Police Department and works specifically with the Highway Patrol and Collision Investigation Squad. And they investigate cases of traffic violence in Brooklyn. But that said, the new Street Safety Bureau represents a significant cultural change in our office. And that starts with the Bureau's name, because the goal of the Bureau is street safety for everyone, not simply punishing those who commit vehicular crimes. The mandate of this new Bureau includes proactive advocacy for policies that prevent traffic violence and supporting victims in addition to prosecuting cases. I appointed a senior assistant district attorney, Ron Snyder, who many of you know, to serve as the new deputy chief of the Street Safety Bureau. Ron has been a bicycle commuter ever since I've known him, and he's a strong supporter of the cycling community for over 15 years. His experience allows him to investigate crashes involving cyclists from the perspective of a cyclist, not from the perspective of a motorist. And I've witnessed firsthand Ron on his way to work be doored by a vehicle. So he really understands the challenges that we face on these streets. He serves as my liaison to the cycling community, and he works with lawmakers on drafting legislation to combat traffic violence. He meets regularly with the police department and other city officials on street safety policy, and he advises our office internally on best practices and policies. We've also expanded the writing program. So the Street Safety Bureau gets involved in cases of traffic violence much sooner than the old Bureau did. Once we receive word from the New York City Police Department that CIS has been activated to a report of a crash involving a pedestrian or a cyclist, the Street Safety Bureau immediately dispatches an assistant district attorney to the scene. The ADA is responsible for helping the NYPD in the identification of all evidence, maybe looking for video, surveillance, speaking to witnesses while their memories are fresh, and documenting relevant information. They also have the responsibility of making initial contact with a victim or victim's family during these difficult times. During all of this, the ADA is in constant contact with their supervisor from the Street Safety Bureau. This is how we handle homicide cases. We have an ADA go out to the scene. A prosecutor responds to the scene in real time. It's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, holidays included. And I believe this will give us extraordinary insight into the circumstances of a crash and substantially will improve our ability to evaluate at an early stage whether criminality is at the root cause. When appropriate, our victim service unit will also respond and send a social worker to the hospital to meet with the victim and the victim's family as part of a victim-centered approach. That support remains available as wraparound services, whether the incident proceeds as a criminal matter or not, much of like we provide services to victims in gender-based violence cases. When the expanded writing program is working, it will allow us to better gather evidence and make decisions about whether a case can be prosecuted by the office. And so I think that that has been a tremendous asset to this fight to reduce traffic deaths. I've heard from many family members the fact that they had a prosecutor on the scene at the time that they lost a loved one has mattered to them. But with all aspects of public safety, I believe we need to look beyond punishment and focus on changing behaviors that cause harm. Especially in less serious traffic infractions, getting drivers to think about the potential consequences of their actions can be more effective in changing behavior than a fine or even an appearance in traffic court. I believe that we can change behavior, and that change of behavior can and will save lives. And as Mary Beth told you, that's why Brooklyn created the first Drivers Accountability Program. In partnership with the Center for Court Innovation, the program takes a restorative approach using a curriculum that was designed in partnership with TA, with Transportation Alternatives, Families for Safe Streets, the NYPD, and even Councilman Brad Lander was involved. We piloted that program in Brooklyn. And the goal was, rather than sitting passively through a lecture, participants had to actively engage in discussions guided by a trained facilitator. They were compelled to engage in meaningful self-reflection about their own driving behaviors and attitudes, and then also discuss what constituted dangerous driving and why. The participants are also powerfully confronted with the voices of victims through testimonials from people who have lost their loved ones, or even from survivors of very terrible crashes. Participants are required to identify their own driving behaviors that they're making a commitment to change, and the concrete steps that they will take to get to that place. The goal is to empower our participants to make meaningful cognitive behavioral changes behind the wheel and then hold themselves accountable. Now, participants in a program are 40% less likely to be rearrested for traffic-related offenses than drivers who had been arrested on similar charges and had not gone through the program. And more impressive than that is that a full 86% have reported that their driving behaviors had been changed as a result of this program. And thanks to the track record of success, the Driver Accountability Bureau program has expanded from a small pilot in Brooklyn to a citywide program. So we think that that's good, and we're going to continue to make sure that all of that continues. In terms of changing behavior and preventing future crashes, all of that, in my estimation, is what success looks like. Sending someone to jail or having them arrested after they injured or killed someone is too late. The person's already lost their life. Now, I understand that sometimes jail will be required for justice and accountability purposes, but we must ensure that we have the tools to prosecute cases successfully when incarceration is required. But that should not be our goal. Behaviors that cause traffic violence. And so we're in a moment of both risk and opportunity for street safety. In the first half of this year, our crashes that resulted in serious injury or death were way down. We know they were down because people were staying home because of COVID. And as people have started to emerge from lockdown, traffic violence has increased. Many more people are avoiding public transportation because of the pandemic. More people are driving, more people are cycling, more people are riding e-bikes and electric scooters. And so this is a potentially deadly combination. Also, we've seen driving habits become worse during COVID. People started to drive more aggressively and ignore the rules of the road much more frequently. I've seen it firsthand. But I've also seen that we have the potential to do things differently right now. There are more open streets. We can fight for more bike lanes. And if we seize this moment of transition to redesign our streets and implement restorative justice programs, we can really change behavior and we can reduce traffic violence. Now, I also think that one of the things that I've been able to really take from my time as DA is the broader goals of Vision Zero, and understanding that Vision Zero is about reducing this traffic violence and this traffic harm, but it's about more than that. It's about supporting efforts to recognize and change environmental, economic, health, and social justice harms caused by the status quo, caused by how we prioritize trucks and SUVs and cars over people. And that must end. And as your district attorney in the borough of Brooklyn, I'm honored to work with all of you in pursuit of those goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, DA Gonzalez. It was a pleasure to hear from you, and we absolutely appreciate your allyship in this work to end traffic violence on New York City streets. Let me say on behalf of Transportation Alternatives and of all the attendees, we're very sorry about the loss of Sarah Pitts. It certainly hit your office and the New York City cycling community, and I'm sure her family and friends very hard.
Thank you for that.
And thank you very much for your updates about the Driver Accountability Pilot Program that has since been expanded citywide, as well as the Street Safety Bureau that you're piloting out of your office. We really appreciate all those innovative steps to try to improve traffic enforcement in New York City. And on that, we're going to be moving on to hear from Kurt Culbertson, excuse me. We're going to be moving outside of the activism and enforcement realm a little bit over to the design realm, where Kurt will be speaking with us about how we transform our streets. Kurt Culbertson is the CEO of Design Workshop. Throughout his 45-year career, Kurt has been a recognized thought leader in landscape architecture, planning, and urban design. Under his leadership, Design Workshop works to increase social equity, amplify connections to nature, and bring joy to everyone through design. Today, Kurt's talk will be entitled Transform the Street, Transform the City. We look forward to hearing it. I turn it over to you, Kurt.
Thank you. I want to speak from my experience, I want to speak from my experiences as a consultant over the last 43 years to cities and communities, and talk about some of the lessons learned in the last 20 years of addressing questions of complete streets and safe streets. It was interesting as the first speakers were talking, certainly understandably emphasizing the tragedy of traffic violence, but also reflecting about how these assignments often come to individuals like me, and the kind of brief, if you will, that are given to firms like ours when they are asked to address complete street questions. Oftentimes the motivation for transforming a street is one of neighborhood revitalization, economic development, perhaps beautification. And if I'm honest, safety is sometimes mentioned, but it's oftentimes not the primary motivation for cities undertaking such topics. But we know that vibrant spaces are safe spaces. We know that vibrant spaces, urban environments, are ones where traffics are calmed, where sidewalks are accessible, where there are eyes on the street, that neighbors look after each other, and they contribute both to our physical health and well-being, but also to our mental health and well-being. What we are often faced with are streets like this, P Street in Lincoln, Nebraska. They're oftentimes high speed, they're one way. As you can see, they're not multimodal. There are no bike or pedestrian facilities. They're really unsafe for cars, for pedestrians, for transit. Crossing distances, as you can see, are enormous. They're often ugly, and they're certainly lonely places to be. These are street environments that you don't drive to, you drive through, and as a result, they are oftentimes quite fast. One of the things that we often encounter with municipal street departments, public works, or state highway departments and so forth is they tend to look at these complete streets projects oftentimes as beautification projects. Touch everything outside the curb line, that's fine. Let's add signage and wayfinding, landscaping, and so forth. But we certainly have to carry the same volume of cars, and we really can't talk about traffic speeds and so forth. And yet what I have learned and tell them repeatedly is that if the street doesn't change, nothing's going to change. Einstein's definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So how can we design streets that are slow and that are calm by design, that function safely, with the kind of enforcement that we've been hearing about, really an essential and additional tool, but streets that will function even when enforcement is not immediately available. So what we found is that you have to build a constituency for complete street transformation. You have to understand what the public desires. You have to understand the kind of cultural and social environment they desire in a street context. And you also have to understand the economic context that they desire as well. And so rather than simply look at automobile traffic, automobile speeds, we found that it's critical to look well beyond the specific street in question. Here in Lincoln, Nebraska, looking 3 to 4 blocks on either side of the main street, P Street, look at a whole range of systems from bike circulation and transit and so forth, to land use as an essential component of that analysis. Because if the merchants, the property owners along this route become an ally in the transformation of the street, then change can more readily happen. And so taking the street that you saw, that desolate place, and creating a kind of landscape environment with dramatically reduced crossing distance, with a with appropriate tactile signalization and crosswalks, places for people to gather and be safely out of harm's way, and traffic calmed dramatically is an important and essential part of the process. There are many things to consider in street design, and what I've learned and found to be the case is you begin with speed. And if you can get city officials, local neighborhoods to agree that speed must be calmed, you've accomplished a huge part of the battle. That can be done to an degree with traffic signage, with enforcement, but it really has to do more often than not with changing the cross section of the street. Many of the travel lanes on our public streets, I'm sure the case is true in New York and Manhattan and elsewhere, but in all over the country, many streets or lanes are 12 feet wide. That's often the same dimension as an interstate highway. And so if I can begin to reduce the number of the width of those individual street lanes and reduce crossing distance, I'm creating a safer environment for pedestrians. If I can, in fact, do a road diet and reduce the number of lanes that are required, we find over and over and over again that the streets in our cities are dramatically oversized. Sometimes streets of 4 lanes and 5 lanes carrying as few as 8,000 cars a day. And so it's a battle to get that section, the road diet, reduced. And only then, after speed has been considered, after cross sections and issues of road diets are considered, then to address questions of materiality. I will tell you that oftentimes landscape architects, like myself, architects, engineers, quickly focus on the aesthetics of the street. They want to spend the budget on materiality, on rich materials, on special crosswalks and street furniture and so forth. And yet it's the safety of the street that is by far the most important consideration. What I've found to be most effective and actually effective every time I've used it is the chart that you see in the upper left-hand corner. And that's to say, and this is an example from South Grand Boulevard in St. Louis, I asked people, what are the odds of what happens to you if you get hit by a car going more than 35 miles an hour? The odds are you're a fatality, right? And so having data, measuring traffic speeds, illustrating to people with this simple chart, the impact of traffic speed on human safety, that one chart stops the conversation and people immediately begin to understand, well, can we get the cars through there at 35 miles an hour or either 25 miles an hour? And what we found in our St. Louis example that you see here is that by mapping individual traffic accidents along the street, by understanding the cost to the city of dealing with traffic accidents, in this particular case, a 6-block section of street, 258 crashes a day, and by lowering speeds and calming traffic, being able to reduce the number of those traffic accidents by 3/4, that there could be substantial savings to the city. And certainly human life, human safety is not something that we want to quantify, but as we're trying to build a case for investment in complete streets and transformation of these streets, building the economic case is one of the arguments that's proven to be effective. Now, your organization really focuses on questions of traffic violence, of pedestrian car, cyclist accidents, and that's certainly a serious consideration. But I think one thing this pandemic has taught us is that environmental health has a direct relationship with human health, that there are issues of spatial equity and environmental justice here. We know that air quality adjacent to streets and highways is poorer in some parts of the city than in others, and more often than not, air quality is poorest in neighborhoods of color, of lower income neighborhoods, and that creating a street environment that is not only free from traffic violence, but also contributes to environmental health is another measure of another form, if you will, of traffic violence perhaps as well. So understanding how we can clean water, clean air, contribute to reduction in air pollution is an essential part of the mission as well. One of the things that, again, that I've encountered in these projects is oftentimes projects are not begun, they're not implemented, they're delayed because there's belief that there's not adequate budget to accomplish the transformation of the street. And in the South Grand example I was mentioning in St. Louis, it was a fascinating problem because only a few blocks away from this study area were the Missouri School for the Blind and the Missouri School for the Deaf. And so the shortening of crossing distance, of the provision of auditory and textural signals and upgrading of ADA facilities was absolutely essential. And so as we engage the local community, as we ask them a series of questions, we ask them things like, oh, would you like the sidewalks to be brick or some type of stone inserts or certain kinds of paving? And much to our surprise, but quite pragmatically, they said, no, what we would like is for the sidewalks to be level. We would like for the sidewalks to have ADA facilities. We would like to simply be able to walk down the sidewalk without falling. And so, as I like to say, precious is nice, rich materials, fancy signage, soft landscaping is fantastic, but it's not essential. And you can see the illustration on the left of how South Grand might be transformed. We put the money into calming traffic. We put the money into reliable and safe sidewalks. And there's been an enormous reduction in traffic accidents, an enormous increase in the economic vitality, the social vitality of the streets. And so we're seeing around the country in this pandemic, simple materials, even the painting of a traffic lane and the narrowing of streets. Certainly New York has done a wonderful job with this, that these solutions don't have to cost money, that action is far more important than the preciousness of the materials or the design that we utilize.
Kurt, that's your time. I'll have to ask you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Kurt. And thank you for bringing us back to the importance of street engineering, of design, in realizing the effects of Vision Zero. In particular, your work in evidence-based design and the importance of bringing data to decision makers and people in communities is really highlighted in your work. So thank you very much for your presentation there. Now, as we move on to our next presenter, Skye Duncan, we'll hear a little bit more about how some of that type of work and focus on design is expanded, not just around the country, but around the globe. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Skye Duncan. Skye Duncan is the director of the Global Designing Cities Initiative, GDCI, at the National Association of City Transportation Officials, or as most of us probably know it, NACTO. Skye and her team produced the award-winning Global Street Design Guide and its recent supplement, Designing Streets for Kids. In support of these global resources, GDCI provides ongoing technical assistance to cities around the world on safe and sustainable street design and mobility. Skye herself is an urban designer with over 15 years of experience in architecture, urban design, and planning. She was recognized as one of TUMI's Remarkable Women in Transportation in 2019. She's worked as senior urban designer at the New York City Department of City Planning, as an international urban design consultant, and as an associate professor at Columbia University in New York City, where she studied as a Fulbright Scholar. Today, Skye will be speaking about designing for Vision Zero. She will offer a tiny and brief window into the work her team has been doing around the globe to fight for safer streets and safer mobility, building off the principles outlined in the Global Street Design Guide. Skye, I turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Bahij. I will share my screen here. So can you see okay there?
Yep, we see.
Awesome. Brilliant. Well, huge thanks to Transportation Alternatives for having me today, to Bahij and all of the team there, and to the other speakers. It's very apt following Kurt's work to switch to think about design. And as Bahij mentioned, that's exactly what I'm going to touch on today. I'm going to go pretty quickly, give us a whirlwind taste. As way of background, as we mentioned, so I head up the GDCI team at NACTO, launched by Jeanette Sadakan about 6 years ago this week, actually. And a lot of our work for the last 6 years has been in part of the Bloomberg Initiative for Global Road Safety, working with cities around the world to address the devastating numbers of 1.35 million traffic fatalities every single year. And more recently, the devastating fact that this is now the #1 killer of ages 5 to 29 of our young people around the globe. So we are very privileged to work alongside a number of different partners in a core group around safer streets and safer mobility. But we work a lot with communications, with data and enforcement partners as well to really take a comprehensive approach to addressing Vision Zero and road safety. One of our first projects was to create the Global Street Design Guide, which is a free download, which really, drew on expertise from many cities and countries around the world, and has since been supplemented by our more recent Designing Streets for Kids work, to really help folks to provide the tools so that people can reimagine and reinvent streets that are safer and also more sustainable. And we kind of take the outdated hierarchical pyramid where the car has been king and we've basically forgotten about people, and turn that on its head to put people first, and in particular our most vulnerable users, people walking, cycling, elderly, those with disabilities, and really encouraging folks to ask what's possible of their existing urban streets, almost like putting on a pair of glasses, because we know we have to get the new stuff right, but if we don't also go back and transform what we have, we're never going to address the crises that we're facing. So we encourage cities to look at how their streets can not only be safer, but how they can be designed to support more functions and for more people. We want to make sure that safety and accessibility is the #1 priority at the heart of all of these moves, but also thinking about health and comfort. And when we're thinking particularly for Streets for Kids, also thinking about inspiration and education opportunities. We're thrilled to have over 100 cities and organizations around the world put their name to this new approach to how we design our urban streets through their endorsement, and have been working on a number of translations, which is very exciting to help spread the word as well. But the bulk of our work also, we want to make sure the stuff doesn't sit on a shelf, but that we can help apply this on the ground. And so we've been working directly with city governments, a number, here are some of them in the last few years. And we take a multi-pronged approach where we help think about policy and design guidance, also capacity building if we're asking people to do things in a different way. And then one of my favorite parts, we're helping folks get projects on the ground and support that with metrics collection and communication. So whether it's helping the city of Bogota do a new street design manual or similar strategies in Sao Paulo in Brazil, running hands-on workshops, not only for engineers and designers and advocacy groups, but also for our police and enforcement colleagues and those who work in media as journalists, who can really help shift the broader perspective of how we talk about these preventable crashes and fatalities. Some of the quick project examples from Sao Paulo, where we have speeding buses and no space for pedestrians to safely cross, can get transformed in a matter of hours, where we can collect metrics and then show how people not only prefer the after condition through qualitative surveys, but that actually through measuring, we're able to get similar throughputs and reduce average speeds. To Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, where day exercises and chalk led with engineers led to the 6-month trial, working with local artists to make the intersection safer. Again, we could demonstrate that speeds were safer and people preferred this, and this enabled the city to invest in capital construction in this case, and then scale up for a citywide program. One of the very impressive cities, Fortaleza in the north of Brazil, has been doing work on corridors to not only reduce speed limits through policy, but work on redesign and enforcement, and seen very impressive results through this type of comprehensive strategy. They've also brought some color and life to the streets while they're working on safety, in examples like this, where Corridors could be narrowed and could demonstrate safer speeds through narrowing and reducing to one lane, but also things like crossing distances could be shortened, turning radii could be tightened, and we were able to demonstrate reduced and safer speeds in this case as well, in addition to actually thinking about how we can make better public spaces, more places for people walking and spending time. And the city is now scaling up this effort to transform spaces outside schools throughout the city, which is really exciting to watch. So from Istanbul in Turkey and the types of transformations we've been helping the cities work on, to Mumbai in India, to Bogota in Colombia, to really rethink this real estate of our street to ensure that we're putting safety at the heart. In Milan, again, transforming spaces outside schools where we have a number of vulnerable users, where parents and kids were waiting in the middle of the roadbed in the before condition and then after. Not only is it much safer, but we have more facilities for cycling and more social spaces for parents and kids to gather. And of course, one of the best things is that a lot of these cities have had very impressive results. So we've seen not only cities like Bogota that have seen a 15% reduction in the last 5 years, but Fortaleza, as I mentioned, who were actually one of the very few cities in the world to meet the mistaken SDG goal of halving fatalities by the year 2020. So they actually did that and received the Vision Zero for Youth Award earlier this year in Stockholm. More recently, we understand that with the pandemic work, this is an increasingly important topic, so I encourage you to take a look online. We have our Streets for Pandemic Response and Recovery that also puts safety and safe movement at its heart, showing examples and case studies from around the world, whether it's Auckland and Milan, Tirana in Albania, examples from the US, of course, rethinking intersections, how we can use paint and color and quick geometric changes, like here in Latvia, but also reduce our speed limits like we see citywide in corridors in Bogota in Colombia. Our team is continuing to work on new resources that will be coming out next year, on handbooks on how to do this work, and another upcoming publication called Designing for Safe Speeds, which will have Vision Zero at its heart. We know now what's possible. We've seen the Helsinkis and the Oslos cut their pedestrian deaths, and it was very exciting for us earlier this year to be at the third ministerial for global road safety in Stockholm, where we're seeing this commitment now through the Stockholm Declaration and then the UN's declaration of a second decade of action to commit to 20 miles per hour or 30 kilometers per hour and really address these terrible global crises numbers. So we know we've got a new goal, dropping by 50% by 2030. We have come a long way, but we've got a long way to go. And it's folks like you guys on this session today. We need your visions and your technical support, but of course also your advocacy and your local action to help us get there. So huge thanks. Thanks again for having me today. I'm happy to chat to anybody afterwards. I do have to step off pretty close in a few minutes, but I'm happy to be in touch with anyone afterwards. Thanks so much again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Skye. It was really inspiring, as a few folks have said in the comments, to see Vision Zero really being implemented in cities around the world. And these kind of quick responses, temporary materials often that really get these solutions on the ground fast so that people can really enjoy the life-saving benefits of Vision Zero and that we can really see how much they make streets come alive. In addition to just saving lives, they really bring out the livelihood, the vivacity of streets and have a lot of energy returned to urban environments.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Skye. Next up, we'll have Lisa Gilson. Lisa Gilson is head of marketing and design at Arity. Arity turns mobility and driver data into meaningful behavioral insights, leveraging telematics to make transportation smarter, safer, and more useful for everyone. A creative storyteller with 25 years of experience building brands, businesses, and doing revenue pipelines, Lisa Gilson is seasoned in local, national, and global marketing and design for both business to consumer and business to business. Her work includes software and data analytics, ad tech, insurance, beverages, both alcoholic and not, and retail. Lisa works at the intersection of innovation, technology, design, and marketing. Today, Lisa will be speaking with us about COVID-19's impact on transportation. The pandemic has prompted major shifts in how we travel from A to B, with fewer commutes and an overall decline in driving countrywide. Will these trends remain, or will things eventually bounce back to how they were pre-pandemic? How can or should organizations respond to these new shifts? Hear how, with more than 400 billion miles of driving data, Arity's team is helping to make sense of how driving is changing and helping to navigate these uncertain times. Really pleased to welcome Lisa Gilson.
Thank you, Bahij. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I think our work is best when you can actually see how the data can come to life. So let me know if you can see my screen or if you see the slide sorter view. And I need to shift displays.
Your
I
screen
just need a hide sign. It's full screen. Fantastic. It worked. That's always great. Okay, well, again, thanks, Bahij, for the kind introduction. I'm guessing that many on the audience haven't heard of Arity before, so let's start with just a little bit more detail of who we are. We are a mobility data and analytics company, and we work with a variety of other companies like auto manufacturers, insurance companies, sharing economy companies like rideshare or car share, or even a gig driving platform, as well as consumer apps. And across all of these businesses, our goal is to help their drivers understand their driving behavior, help them manage their risk, and become safer behind the wheel. So we have lots of partnerships, and through those partnerships, we have close to 400 billion miles of historical anonymized driving data, and we have more than 23 million active telematics connections, and about 10 years of experience analyzing that data from both cars and from mobile devices. We work across all of these different industries, and it gives us a really unique perspective on personal driving and personal mobility, but this has become really interesting in this time of the pandemic. Just to give you a visualization of the type of data that we have on our platform, this is a point map of the GPS trails that we have from a single day's worth of trips pre-pandemic. This was in January. And again, this is multi-source. It's anonymized and aggregated. We don't know who was driving which point. But all of those points do live on our database. And we have credible representation of every state in the US for at least 1 year. We've got all different kinds of segments represented: families, single vehicles, in cities and in rural, but these are primarily personal driving trips. So it's really representative of personal driving patterns across the country. Now, what made it really interesting, you'd probably, like me, would say that we're living in a most unique time. This pandemic has fundamentally transformed transportation. We've seen really major shifts on how we travel, with fewer commutes and an overall decline in driving worldwide, but in our data, in countrywide. Now, everybody in this conference is playing their part in trying to make transportation safer. If you're a bike advocate, or perhaps a micromobility or scooter company, you're maybe looking for where to put the best bike lanes and how to place more new micromobility assets. But things have changed so significantly. How do you know where to do that now? Well, our data has been able to give us a front row seat to really understanding the where, the how, and even how much people are moving. And one thing that we've learned, that the story of this pandemic is a local story, that you have to account for geographic differences. Even within the US, people have responded differently to the pandemic. So what I have up on screen now is an animation that actually describes exactly that. It's a bivariate choropleth map, which is kind of a fancy or cool way of saying, I want to show you two kinds of data at once: the change in miles driven and the change in COVID-19 cases by county in the United States. So this is a map broken out by county. Now here in the upper left, this deeper blue is what I would call normal. It's lots of driving and very few new COVID cases. It's about where the US was back in March of this year. And down here in the dark yellow is an example of what I would call the really aggressive lockdown state. There's lots of new COVID cases and driving is way down. Now, this dark blue or almost black is actually representation of people increasing their driving despite a rapidly increase of new COVID cases. And so what I'd like to do is I've got a little animation here and I'm going to actually play it. I'm going to pause it and you're going to watch how this map changes county by county. So fingers crossed this all works the way it should have worked when I did it in practice. So here we go. Let's see. We're going to watch it go through and you can see I'm going to stop it right about here. Oops. Whoa, 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 whoa. Now I went too far. Let me go back. I'm going to try again. Here we go. And I am going to pause it here. Now you can see we've got a lot of yellow COVID cases, definitely expanding, and people are adjusting their habits. Now this was kind of in the midst of our shelter in place orders across, really across the globe, although we're looking here at the US. But watch what happens as we get further into the summer. And here we go. You can see how those COVID cases are now starting to actually move from this yellow up to this brown, meaning that we still have an increase in COVID cases, but actually you're starting to see about June, especially in the southern states, that we almost talk about this as COVID fatigue. That people are starting to get really fatigued with the lockdown and they're starting to have more movement, much more like normal. And you're going to see that play out as we get further and further into the summer. And you can see more and more of this chart getting more and more yellow, or more and more kind of that orangish brown, where even in the West and even in the upper Midwest, you're starting to see people start to move again, even despite the fact that COVID cases are going up. Now watch as we get a little further into the summer, and now we're going into August and even early September, and look at this when you get here. Take a look at now, we've got increases in COVID cases, but along the eastern seaboard and some of the cases in the Southwest, we've actually seen a rapid increase in cases and a rapid increase in miles at the same time, which is actually very different than up in the Northeast. So again, I go back to what we have seen in our data is a real difference by geography. It's not simply state by state or even necessarily tied to how the states have either been more permissive or less permissive in their shelter in place restrictions. And we've been able to see not only how those miles have changed, but we've actually been able to see in our data how the actual behavior behind the wheel has changed. So in fact, we've seen upwards of 70% drop in total miles in some states. And those numbers definitely have stabilized, as the map showed before, but it's been very different state by state. So states like New York and Florida and New Jersey led the way in some radical changes up front, but states like Florida, Wyoming, Idaho, and Oklahoma actually are now not only back to pre-pandemic levels, but in some cases they're even higher. And we've actually seen a real shift in when people are driving. Daily commutes look really different post-pandemic. Weekdays are starting to feel more like weekends. And actually midday trips are on the rise. And they now encompass more than 22% of all weekly trips. But one of the biggest changes that we've seen in our data is around speeding. Not only has speeding increased on average, but we're also seeing increased incidences of what we would call extreme speed, or speeds greater than 80 miles an hour. We usually see seasonality in our data in speeding, especially during the summer months. But in 2020, that even shifted. We saw those increases, but those increases weren't at the beginning of the summer, but they grew in late summer. And in August and September, they were some 33% higher than what we observed in 2019. So the reality is, we've never lived through a period quite like this. And if you're anything like me, you probably felt a bit uncertain or even times scared. But at Arity, we really believe that knowledge is truly power. And the more data you have and understanding how that behavior is changing, the better equipped we all are in being able to navigate these changing times and help drive positive change towards a safer, smarter, and more useful future for transportation. So thank you for having me, and I'll turn it back over to Bahij.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Looks like we just lost Skye Duncan, but thank you very much. Your talk was very elucidating. It's amazing what you can learn from the data when you get it all in one place to see some of the confluence between the effects of COVID-19 on people's travel behavior and actually what people are doing out on the roads. It's not a huge surprise to me that there's been some more speeding while the roads emptied out for a bit, but it's a shocking thing to see and definitely will affect the course of our work. All right, I'm going to turn it over to questions now, and I'll give a last plug. Folks, the Q&A function on Zoom is still open. If you're a participant and you're interested in hearing from our remaining speakers a little bit more about one of the topics that they covered, or have a question you'd love them to address, please go ahead, put that in the Q&A. We're looking for questions to pose to our speakers. I'm going to start off with a few that are already in the chat. And this first question is for Kurt. Someone has asked, let's see, who was the person who's asked? An anonymous attendee has asked, how do we convince traffic engineers to stop swearing by the 85th percentile in regards to improving street design? And if I'm correct, I believe they're referring to a common traffic engineering practice to set the speed limit at the 85th percentile of the average speed of cars that drive down a road. So Kurt, go ahead.
I have a traffic engineer I work with in Denver from time to time who made a very interesting conversation. Ooh, can you hear me? I have a traffic engineer that I worked with in Denver one time made a very interesting statement at a conference. He said, you know, as the complete street movement really began, he said, you know, engineers are very good at solving problems. And in the 60s, you gave us the problem, 50s and 60s, you gave us the problem of moving lots of cars and moving them as fast as we could. Now the parameters have changed and we're willing to embrace this new assignment. And he said that sincerely. And what I have found is that engineers want data, and candidly, all of us, particularly in a political context, want some kind of political cover. And so if you can have a very robust community engagement process on a street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood basis, I've found that local neighborhood residents will come out overwhelmingly in favor of calmer streets, safer streets. And if you have the data, can run, as we did in the St. Louis example, I gave traffic sim models to show that the street would still function at a lower speed. We've been quite successful in getting these standards reduced on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you very much, Kurt.
Yeah.
The next question has come up posed to Lisa Gilson from Arity. Dimitri Kotumbas has asked how the trip data is obtained, and there's an additional question in the chat that I'll pose to you as well from Nancy Adams, Lisa, who asks, is the map or data available? And if yes, where would it be accessible?
I was actually just typing back a message back to Nancy, but I'll answer it verbally as well. So yes, that map is available. So that animation is actually available on our website, arity.com. And so you can actually play it and stop the animation so that you can see the differences. We have been working with a variety of different sources, both public and private, on getting access to the actual raw data based on a use case. And you can actually reach out to me if you have a specific interest in using that data, and we can talk about what parameters you might like it. It is my email is lisa.gilson, JILLSON @arity.com. And then to answer Dimitri's question, the data is multi-source. So we have, Arity has its technology embedded in some mobile apps that are used for driving. We also have data that we work with several different insurance companies, and we have data that is connected to some programs that those insurance companies have, as well as we also have connections through the OEM. So it really is multi-source data.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And the Transportation Alternative staff have been kind enough to put your email contact in the chat for folks who are interested in getting in touch with you, possibly using that data. I saw someone mentioning a graduate research project right after my own heart. Finally, we've got a question in the chat that's come up from Henry Cross. The question is, beyond data science, what is the role of Kunst art for micromobility in 2021? It's an interesting question. I think it could be answered by a few of our speakers today. So I'll invite anyone who wants to step in. If you believe that there is a role for art, or maybe more broadly design, to play in micromobility, what might that be?
Can you repeat the question again, Bahij?
Sure. The question was, beyond design science, what is the role of art in micromobility for 2021? That's a fairly broad question. So
It is.
I know you've got a time to mull over it. I saw Kurt maybe had an answer he was coming to the mic for. We'll see.
I was actually pondering, we're working in Northwest Arkansas in a biking situation where the client specifically has an interest on art. And I think the important thing is probably with any form of mobility, be it micro mobility or cyclists or pedestrians, you know, if you can create a place that people want to come to as opposed to go through, then I think speed is reduced. The quality of the experience goes up exponentially. I think people have more heightened awareness of their surroundings, and certainly that's one of the great roles of art, is to make us aware of our environment and surroundings. So we're working on a project in Northwest Arkansas to try to create moments, memorable moments along the journey, and so I can see art playing that kind of role.
Thank you, Kurt. And if you're anything like me, you might envision art as also being beautiful data visualization, which Lisa brought to the table for us, which can be a very persuasive tool when used with communities, when used with city planning officials to get toward the aims that we seek. Now, Mary Beth Kelly, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation for a moment and ask you a question that was originally posed to DA Gonzalez. Someone had asked the DA whether they envisioned restorative justice practices being used in their work. Now, Mary Beth, I know you left off a little bit speaking about restorative justice, and I had wondered, not necessarily knowing the answer from the DA's office, if you've seen restorative justice practices actively being brought into this type of work in traffic violence, or if you are aware of any glimmers of hope or places where it might be happening now.
The closest to it that I'm aware of is the is the program in Brooklyn and that it doesn't really qualify as true restorative justice, but it takes elements of the process and brings them in. But again, these are drivers who have committed non-victim violations. And I would love to know if there's progress made in this area in other places. I haven't found it to date. And in fact, there's self-help groups for everything, right? But there are no self-help groups for these, CADIs, these, causing accidental death and injury. And I think it has to do a lot with the shame that goes with it. So I think I hope it's going to be a work in progress.
Thank you very much, Mary Beth. And I will ask one final question posed by Nina before I close us out as we near 6:30 this evening. Nina Sabir asks to Lisa Gilson, is anyone looking at vehicle size? And Nina is in particular wondering if Arity looks at vehicle size when examining this data.
So we don't always know. In fact, often we don't know what the size of the vehicle is because much of our data is generated from a mobile app. It more follows the driver than it follows the vehicle itself. Where we have data on the specific vehicle, we certainly pull that through. But for much of our data, we are following through a mobile app environment. So it's embedded actually on the phone, and we don't know if somebody, well, we've got some sense if somebody is on a train or in a boat or on a bike, because we have machine learning that actually will capture what kind of trip it is, but we can't tell you if you're in an SUV versus a truck versus a van. That is at a level that we're not yet able to actually dive into the data and be able to tell by trip.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And with that, I think that I will close out the Vision Zero Vignette session of today's portion of the Vision Zero Cities Conference. It's been an absolute pleasure. First off, I'd like to thank all of our speakers very, very much. In order, Mary Beth Kelly, Brooklyn DA, Eric Gonzalez, I believe followed by Kurt Culbertson of Design Workshop, who was followed by Skye Duncan of NACTO, and finally Lisa Gilson at Arity. If you can, we can't really give a visual thank you to all of our speakers, but whatever praise you might be able to put in the chat, I'm sure is much appreciated by all of them. I'd also love to thank all the attendees of today's event. Thank you very, very much for coming out. We appreciated your engagement, your questions, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the Vision Zero Cities Conference. And finally, thank you so much to our hosts, TA, for putting together this incredible event. We appreciate everyone's dedication to this conference, for coming out, for sharing ideas, for networking across cities, across disciplines. We believe that it's this kind of work that can really make Vision Zero a reality. So for those of you who know TA, who don't know TA, please take a look. We need your support, we need your engagement, and if you can, we need your donations as well, as we are a nonprofit that works to advance this cause. So thank you all very much to our speakers. Thank you to our attendees, and I hope everyone has a wonderful Monday evening.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Good night all.